evening, everyone. Welcome to M+ and to the Lars Nittve Keynote lecture. We're thrilled to have Mami Kataoka here today. Before we begin, I just want to share with you a couple of important pieces of information that you should know during the talk. So most of you hopefully have already figured out that this talk will be in English, but there will be simultaneous interpretation in Cantonese and Mandarin, so make sure you have a headset from the desk outside. Please make sure your mobile phones are switched off or powered down so that they don't accidentally ring during our talk. The talk is being live streamed, so hello out there to all of us joining us online. It's a thrill to have you here. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session, so Dorian will join Mami to moderate a short conversation, but then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So please make sure if you want to ask a question, you scan the QR code and you can enter your question at any time. So I'd now like to welcome Dorian Chong, our Deputy Director and Chief Curator, who will introduce Mami and the talk that we'll be hosting this evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm delighted to have you all join us this evening for the third lecture in the Lars Nittve Keynote Lecture Series. Named after M+'s inaugural director, Dr. Lars Nittve, this Keynote Lecture Series invites renowned artists, scholars, and thinkers to share their insights on broader cultural ideas and urgent topics of our time. The lecture series is generously sponsored by the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, Hong Kong, for which we are deeply grateful. M+'s current exhibition, Yayoi Kusama 1945 to Now, remains on view for just 17 more days, until May 14th at M+. And this evening, we are pleased to host our final talk about this remarkable artist, Yayoi Kusama. While working on this exhibition with my co-curator, Mika Yoshitake, we knew that as we collectively persevered through the pandemic and the resulting isolation, the Kusama's work would resonate for many. And throughout the run of this exhibition, we have been struck by the way in which this exhibition has touched our audiences, and in particular, the comments our visitors have made about how Kusama's art practice is connected to the artist's mental health, and in turn, the visitor's own. It is very fitting this evening, then, that we have invited Mami Kataoka for this evening's keynote lecture titled From Yayoi Kusama's Art to Our Wellbeing. In her lecture, Mami will discuss Yayoi Kusama and her work as a point of departure, and then trace how other artists have also addressed their modern-day anxiety through a range of distinctive artistic practices and voices. Mami Kataoka is an internationally renowned and widely admired curator. She was the inaugural chief curator of the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo from 2003. Then she became deputy director and chief curator, and currently she's the director of the museum. Since March 2023, she has another title as the director of the National Center for Art Research, a new institution connecting important national museums in Japan. Mami has been an extremely active curatorial practitioner outside Japan as well. She was the first international curator at the Hayward Gallery in London from 2007 to 2009. She was a co-artistic director for the 9th Gwangju Biennale in 2012 in Korea, the artistic director of the 21st Biennale de Sydney of 2018, and the artistic director of the Aichi Triennial in 2022. She has served as the board member from 2014 to 2020, and then as president of CMOM, the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Modern Art. Also a sought-after writer, lecturer, and professor, Mami has conceived and realized groundbreaking projects in contemporary Asian art, addressing urgent social, cultural, historical themes, and introducing numerous emerging and established artists from Asia in the global art scene. In her curatorial work, Mami has demonstrated much care and interest about well-being and art, especially through her understanding of the practices of artists she has worked with in recent years. We will hear more about that in Mami's presentation. So it is with great pleasure and privilege to welcome Mami Kataoka, my longtime friend and mentor, to the stage to present the third M+ Lars Nittve keynote lecture. Please join me in welcoming her with a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Dorian, for extended introduction, and thank you very much, M+, everyone in a team, to have me tonight. And as Dorian introduced, I would like to talk about starting from Yayoi Kusama's practice, but also to really think on what is the well-being and an art. I particularly wanted to start from one quote that I found in Kusama's show. There are many quotes in exhibition, but there was one very nice quote in front of the shop. And Kusama said, "I create art for the healing of all mankind." It seems that Kusama is very popular with this polka dot and net painting, and a lot of people probably thinks that she was doing for herself, but it's really interesting to see she was thinking about healing of all mankind. And she said, "My life, a dot, that is one of the million particles, a white net of nothingness composed of an astronomical aggression of connected dots, will obliterate me and others and the whole of the universe." And actually, looking at her works, probably every 10 years in a major exhibitions in the past 30 years, I am actually interested in what actually she is looking at and in her vision. And she's kind of tracing her visions onto canvas and also installations, and also trying us to have a similar experience that she was going through. Then, particularly with the relationship with the universe, that she is kind of obliterating her into the universe. Then, walking through Kusama exhibitions, I have found her way of giving a title to the paintings quite intriguing. And I'll just introduce a few examples. This is Shouting to the Universe from 2012. And this little kind of lion head, or the flower-like head, is shouting to the universe. And this one, I love the title too, that Women Who Went Sightseeing to the Universe. And yeah, this is also like two women walking through the universe, and yeah, just imagine what these people are looking at. But also this work from 2019, War Towards the Mystery of the Universe, that speaks to us across the darkness of the universe. So yeah, when I paid attention to her cosmological perspective, then I started to look at these works that she's really looking at herself or people within a larger universe. She said, "When I'm painting net on canvas, it runs from desk to floor and eventually all over my own body. By repeating the same thing over and over, the net stretches into infinity. In other words, at that point I forget myself, surrounded by netting, and my hands and feet, the clothes I'm wearing, the whole room becomes filled with netting." And this really makes us imagine that what she's actually looking at by seeing everything surrounding her is, yeah, probably doesn't have an outline of any sorts. And then just going through the whole universe that she's like floating. Yeah, then I said, I wrote in my article a few years back that one can interpret this as an act of eliminates the contours of things visible in the real world to reveal that everything in creation is interconnected. And if you consider, for instance, her series of sculptures covered in phallus-like protrusions or her performances, one can readily arrive at the feminist interpretation of Kusama's intention in producing these works. But for the artist who has a sexual fear of the phallus that comes from childhood experience, to use the object of fear repeatedly as a motif in her work. This part is very important, that she has been keeping using the similar motif over and over again, was an act aimed not so much at the liberation of women generally, as it was intended to inform the liberation of Kusama herself in an example of psychosomatic art. So yeah, this is how she calls it, psychosomatic art. Then but going back to these quotes that I create art for the healing of all mankind. So it's not even for herself, it's more for the all mankind. And then this brings me to the question that I was thinking in the last few years, particularly after COVID. When we had to close the museum and artists couldn't really work properly, then what is the fundamental role of museums as real physical space where art and its audience encounter each other or sites of artistic expression? And we also had to ask, how can we explain the legitimacy and the validity of art and art museums when their significance has been fundamentally undermined, and when people's ways of looking at the things about things have changed during COVID. Yeah, I think something like a COVID, unprecedented health crisis globally, we all experienced, and the way we look at the world has probably changed. And we had to think about our life itself, or cycle of life, a little bit closer or deeper than before COVID. Then I looked at this 2019 report. The WHO Regional Office for Europe published a report entitled, "What is the Evidence on the Role of the Arts in Improving Health and Well-Being?" The study was partially motivated by the lack of evidence required for policy making and practice with respect to well-being, particularly in European countries, and the analysis was based on more than 900 publications. And actually, you can Google this title, and then everything you can download on PDF. The overall findings from the report states that art, they're looking at performing arts, visual arts, design, crafts, and literature to exhibitions, concerts, and other art forms like online art, may lend credence to claims that they have definite effects on mental and physical health. And it acknowledged the role that the arts can play in improving health and well-being, and added value that an engagement with the arts can bring to bear on health, and highlights the cross-disciplinary nature of the arts and the field of health. Then after you read these analytical sort of result of the report, then I had to ask how artists deal with their fear, trauma, and other emotions, and how this could improve their well-being as well as our well-being as an audience. Then after looking at Kusama, I started sort of imagining connections, resonance with other artists who would also made me think about the well-being by making their art. One artist is Louise Bourgeois. And it's quite interesting that Kusama was born in 1929, and she's has longer career, and she lived in New York from 1958 to 1973. and Louise Bourgeois, who lived until 99, and she was born in 1911 and lived until 2010. And she moved to New York from Paris in 1938 after married Robert Goldwater. So I was imagining maybe these two women artists have crossed on the street in New York at the time when Kusama was there. And then Louise also said that it's about her art. It is not an image I'm seeking. It's not an idea. It's an emotion you want to recreate. An emotion of wanting, of giving, and also of destroying. So how do you depict or give a form to this emotion which doesn't really have a form? And then I look at another quote by Louise Bourgeois that the polarity I experience is a drive towards extreme violence and revolt and retiring. I wouldn't say passively, but a need for peace, a complete peace with the self, with others, and with the environment. Then you started to resonate what Kusama said about all these net and polka dots expanded around her towards the universe. And then Bourgeois, the comments is really about the complete peace with herself, but also with others and with the environment, which I found it quite interesting. But then these contradictory fears that she talks about. I'm afraid to be alone, inverted fears. I'm afraid of visitors. I am scared of the world. I'm scared of death. I'm ready to receive. I'm ready to run away. I'm afraid of calling on the phone. I'm afraid not to call to forget. So this contradictory emotional state is something quite apparent in her works as well. For instance, this work called The Destruction of the Father. And as Kusama had a very difficult relationship with the father and the mother, the Louise also had quite love and hate relationship with the father. So you find this sort of half sphere form of protrusions, and then this has a red neon light inside of this kind of work. But this similar form you also find in this work called Clouds and Caverns. So caverns like you kind of contain yourself, but also clouds seems to be the way that you liberate yourself to the larger sky or larger universe. So it looks like a sign of the emancipation or liberty. But also this form of sort of like a round form, like a woman's breast, appears again over and over in her works. And this is a series of nature study that it's said to be her practices on self-portrait. And this looks like women's body, but with this 6 breasts with animal-y form. And if you look this piece from the back, you see it really sort of skinny body with the spine. And she made this form with latex, and she made the performance that everyone has to wear these latex breasts, like multiple breasts. And she said confrontation has to do with sexuality between generations, the attraction of one generation towards the other, of an older person for younger. It goes both ways, because it is not possible, it ends in death. So these kind of, again, contradictory elements that you find in her works are quite strongly emotionally driven, but quite sort of analytical in a way. Another artist I thought about is Chiharu Shiota, that I curated her major retrospective in 2019. And this show had been traveling throughout Asia and Pacific during this COVID time, because this show ended in October 2019, and then went to Busan. And then during the Busan presentation, COVID wave came in, and we had to close, and we had to bring all the crates back to Tokyo. But then had been traveling to Taipei, Shanghai, Brisbane, and just finished at the Indonesia in Macan. So by seeing her works, and this is called Uncertain Journey, and she made for the first time in 2016 and recreated in 2019. And she says that this kind of fear towards uncertain future is actually driving force for her to keep making art. And she said, I cannot be happy because then I don't have to make work. So I have to keep having this fear for uncertainty so that I can always come up with new ideas. So this one you can see that these small boards, like 6 boards, are in the space. And then those are connected with red thread throughout the space. Then you are being welcome to go through this installation. And the small board is not the big ship. So it's a symbol of instability. And then you really don't know, like a small leaf on the larger ocean, where it is really going. So these kind of questions that often appears in her work. And she says, when making my work, I was always unable to get over the boundary between this physical body and more spiritual dimension, this realm that is shared by the universe with me and the cosmos outside. And this is also quite interesting that she's also thinking that there is a small cosmic world realm in her body, and somehow it connects with outside cosmic world. And when I asked her to have a solo exhibition, major solo exhibition at the Mori Art Museum in 2017, and following day, she went to see the doctor, and she was announced that she has this, the ovary cancer came back after 12 years. So it had been very difficult time for her to come up with new piece for this exhibition. And this is a new work that she made for the show, Externalized Body. And you can see these, looks like a body parts, like body organs, but made with cow, like leather. And then those kind of internal body was externalized. And then she put, she put these body parts that she casted her own body parts. Then, this is some close-up. And she used to do performances using her own body, but she didn't really did for a long time because she wanted to really express the presence in absence, so that she didn't really sort of use her own body in her work. But after knowing that her actual physical body might disappear from the world, then she started to cast, just like trying to leave some trace or memory of her own existence. And then also she started to use glass. This was the first time she used the glass, and she went to a glass laboratory, and then making this new work called the rebirth and passing. And so you can see this glass object with the sort of cancer cell, or like a general, like a cell-looking object. But then inside of this circular placement, you see these small body parts of the porcelain antique dolls, and then she started to connect them. So this is really like her ways of trying to deal with the relationship between soul and the physical body. And that's why the exhibition called The Soul Trembles, and she was really going through the time that after she dies, where my body goes and my soul goes. And she says, when a human life reaches its prescribed lifespan, perhaps it dissolves into the universe. Perhaps death does not involve transformation into nothingness and oblivion, but is merely a phenomenon of dissolution. Going from life to death is not an extinguishing, but the process of dissolving into something vaster. If this is the case, then there is no longer any need to be afraid of this. And both dying and living belongs to the same dimension. And this exhibition called Listen to the Sound of the Earth Turning, Our Wellbeing Since the Pandemic. And this exhibition at the Mori Art Museum was displayed from June last year to the January this year. And this idea came, of course, after the pandemic. And we had to close the museum for 5-6 months. And then even in 21, we also closed again for 6 weeks. Then, earlier question that I had, and what can we do as an art museum and for our well-being? And is it, what is it that we are doing art still in this kind of circumstances? And this exhibition title, Listen to the Sound of the Earth Turning, is a quote from Yoko Ono's 1960s book called The Grapefruits. And she compiled this very beautiful instruction art book. Then this idea of imagination, that you can only imagine to listen to the sound of the earth turning. And she said during the World War II, when there's nothing to eat, and Yoko Ono and her brother had to start talking about something that they wanted to eat when they were starving. So they were talking about, let's think about tonkatsu, let's think about ice cream, and these ways to use your imagination, you could overcome these difficulties. And in this exhibition, we invited 16 artists from Japan and also abroad in different ways of dealing with their mental state and well-being, and also the very different ways of selecting motifs and concepts and materials. And Yuki Iyama, a Japanese artist who dealt the issue of domestic violence. And she herself experienced this domestic violence with a former partner, and then she went to consultation to ask the people who had a similar experience, but also instructor and advisor. Then she ended up made this new piece called Eating the Patriarchy. So she made this huge bread of the life size of her former partner, and then she was crying but eating up. By confronting these difficulties with traumatic experience, then she was going to overcome. And she said, for me, mental health is a state where a person's thoughts or feelings are not unfairly controlled or denied by anything. So she was trying to sort of liberate herself and her emotion by confronting these, the fearful experience. And this is something I thought was kind of resonate with what Kusama was doing. And Masashi Kanazaki, I was also intrigued by his work, and he has this extraordinary power of concentration by putting these layers of newspaper and a magazine over and over with the glue. And this is the form that he started from the ground and grown to the different direction, and then after a certain time, the bottom was cut off from the board. Then now we are looking at the bottom of his sculpture. But he is diagnosed with autism. And according to his instructor, that one of the characteristics of autism is a narrow field of vision. When an autistic person focuses on the single point, the surroundings do not register at all. And Kanazaki's ability to sustain a single task with a high degree of concentration is applied to his creative activities as an accumulation of time spent on creation, traces of consciousness, and the proof that he lives every day calmly. And yeah, like someone like me who doesn't really have much concentration on anything, it's really, I pay huge respect for what he does, with just not really looking at other things around and then keep putting these thin paper with glue. And then naturally this form is made. So maybe he doesn't have this form in the vision as a goal. It naturally goes with the flow of what he does. And then the other artist we introduced is called Robert Cutlas from France. And he was also quite unknown artist. And, but he was painting these little cars, but just like the size of your iPhone. And it's like a nice iPhone case. But after World War II, he was working in a factory and began studying and creating his own art. And by the time he was 16, he wanted to pursue the career as an artist, but his parents threw away his works. And he even tried to commit suicide. And then his parents went to the priest. How can we do with my son? But then priest told them that your son was born to be an artist, so you have to let him continue his artistic career. And he won some prize and he sold some work, but he didn't really want to continue his practices in this the typical art world, but he continued his own practices. So this series called My Nights, like night painting. And he went out to find these cardboard on the street and then continue to depict similar motifs and over again. And his the last partner was a Japanese lady, and who kept all of these things that he was kind of doing in-house, in his room. So we were lucky to be able to show his works. But this also, similar to some of those artists that we had looked at, that why he was doing it was just for himself and really try to sort of liberate himself from all these feelings and emotions. Then we showed the artist Sumi Kanazawa. The first time I saw her works, it's very striking to look at this shiny surface, but this shininess comes from graphites that she uses on the newspaper. And this was huge installation that we showed. It's 5 meters high and over 10 meters wide, maybe 30 meters. She said, the first time I filled in the sheet of newspaper with a pencil, I was overcome with a sensation that made me feel as if I could see stars that were invisible to the naked eye. So what she does is using a very sort of soft pencil, and then after she takes care of her son, and then after he goes to bed, then she started to open up the newspaper on the living room. Then she started just draw, and then make all the letters disappeared, except some of the headlines or pictures that she wanted to look at, a close look. Then there was all these times that Russian invaded Kiev, and also some of the images about our former exhibitions in 21, looking at 16 women artists whose age was over 70, together with some of the article about inequality of the gender in Japanese society, so that it starts connecting these different articles from different time, like a constellation of the sky. Then you start making your own connection from one to the other. And this kind of overwhelming experience that as a viewer, to start seeing these social political issues that you read on a newspaper, but then goes onto the vast universal sort of cosmic space, then it kind of being dissolved in a larger space. Then this work by Monten Bunma was shown next to Sumi Kanazawa's work. And Montien, who died quite young, from Thailand, but it's called Nature's Breath. It's very important work by him. And he said, I hope that my work will activate people's delicate feelings and perceptions. I hope that these feelings will return to people as they used to be in the nature of human beings. So this is meant to be like a little shrine. And then you are invited to come underneath. This is just from the different angle. And once you come inside or come underneath of this small shrine, you see these forms. It looks really like a land. Then on the surface of these, looks like shoe boxes, but then with the metal net, then inside there are different kinds of medicinal herbs from Thailand and different places, and those are kind of sort of coated over the surface of these boxes. So yeah, you really feel that you can sort of breathe in depth, and then started to bring back your nature's breath. And then yeah, I forgot to say at the beginning that this exhibition was really trying to bring back your 5 senses when you come into the museum. Because when you have gone through all these online gallery tours, we did so many, but something that it doesn't really go beyond the screen is the sense of scale, but also the smell doesn't come through your iPhone or iPad. So this experience of having this medicinal herb smell is so much of the feeling that you kind of being healed by these smells. And then Tsai Chao-wei from Taiwan, and she had been studying different Eastern philosophy and religions and different branches of the Buddhism from Tibet to Thailand and Vietnam, Japan, all these different places. And for her, art transcends dualistic ways of thinking and brings us closer to the understanding of reality. And this beautiful piece that she showed is called the womb and the diamond. The womb and the diamond follows the form of a mandala of the 2 realms found in esoteric Buddhism. And mandalas are simple illustrations of the Buddha's teaching, and the mandala of the 2 realms represents the entirety of the universe in the esoteric world through the 2 mandalas that depicts both the diamond realm and the womb realm. And diamond is representing the strongest substance of the universe. But then when it goes to the womb realm, it really represents the motherness or the kindness to embrace people. So these 2 mandalas, the left square is the diamond realm, and right-hand side is the womb realm. So a set of 2 mandalas are often seen in the esoteric Buddhism, but she made it with the mirror so that it kind of reflects entire universe. So if you look into the mirror, then you see ourselves and also the universe. Then yeah, these are the blown glass in part of this womb realm mandala that she asked the high Buddhist priest to give a breeze into this inside of the glass. And last piece I wanted to share with you is this work by Wolfgang Leib. This is actually the piece that, one of the first piece I wanted to really see it after COVID happened. And I have seen this work in early 90s, and I was so touched by this smallest particle, which is the flower pollen. And this something also, it doesn't give you the sense of the materiality with these slides, because you have to come and see this finest powder from the flower. But this contains all the nutritions for the flowers to grow. And he came to install by shifting these the 3 bottles of hazelnuts flower pollen, which he collected over the time. Then, yes, he said in 1 year, for maybe 3 months in springtime, he can only collect maybe half the bottle. Then, so it really takes time. Then, so he came to shift on this platform, but actually, yeah, this is how he grown this installation. And yeah, because he just do it organically, he placed this a piece of tissue at the 4 corners when he wants to end this the shape. So this is the one of the small tissue that he placed on the platform. But actually, this is myself. Because when he came, I mean, at the beginning of the show, he was supposed to come, but suddenly he couldn't come because of the health issue. And then I had such a privilege as a museum director to be able to shift this pollen, first time in my life. And but actually at the time, 3 days before this action, I had my operation on my throat. I had a polyp so that I couldn't talk. So I was contained within a mask, but also I couldn't really have any voice. So I was totally kind of embraced within the world of Wolfgang Leib. And then my colleague Mina was connecting me with Wolfgang, drinking morning tea in his German home. Then, yeah, we were just making this form naturally and then communicating through WhatsApp, and it was a very special moment. But then he said he will hire me if he needs assistance in the future. But anyway, we could do it like this, and then I wanted the flower pollen to communicate with the actual sunlight. So normally we close this the ceiling window, but we could open up and then have some time. Particularly this was the morning hours from like 11:30 to 12. All this sunlight comes in the museum. So that was more like feeling the meadow. Then yeah, this was really a mesmerizing experience to see it. Then yeah, Wolfgang sent this beautiful poem in early 2020, right after I said I wanted to use or introduce this work for one of the TV program. He said, day after day, many weeks, sitting in a dandelion meadow with highest concentration, intensity, forgetting time, yourself, your mind and body, in the middle of an incredible, unconceivable crisis and chaos around the world, many people becoming very sick and dying. Is that the new plague? Like 600 years ago, which we could never have imagined that it would come again. Today, now in our life and with our life. But still, every crisis, the bigger the more, the brought humanity to a different future, help to go somewhere else and find something else beyond what we could have imagined. we find new ways to be and to live what we want and what we want in our lives. What is important and what is not important. Modesty, humility, a totally different relationship to yourself and to everybody else, to the world, to the nature, and to the universe, and different expectations of yourself and the world, new visions of a new future for life. I thought was such a beautiful way of thinking from this smallest particle like flower pollen, and then goes to the larger universe. So how, again, by thinking about yourself, but liberating yourself from this real world and bringing you towards the larger cosmic space. It's probably something that give you the freedom and state of emancipation. And that really often, a lot of Buddhist teaching talks about unity of microcosmos of your body and macrocosmos of the larger universe is a way for the emancipation. And yeah, this is something around how I had been looking at Kusama's work, again, going back to these earlier quotes, and how she liberates herself, but also in a larger sense, and it becomes a psychosomatic art. And again, let's look at the first quotes that I read. "My life a dot, that is one of the million particles, a white net of nothingness composed of an astronomical aggression of connected dots will obliterate me and others and the whole of the universe." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mami, for really generously sharing on your on your practice, but also such a range of artist practices and many of their thoughts and ideas. We could go in so many different directions to discuss. So what we will do is to spend maybe 15, 20 minutes just having a little bit follow-up chat about the presentation that you have just heard. But we want to leave some time to also take your questions. So again, I think you can see is there QR code right there? So you can scan the QR code and use the app Slido to type questions, and then we have moderators who will also help to select questions for us. But because this is in the context, of course, our Yayoi Kusama exhibition here at M+, one of the most comprehensive retrospectives of the artist's career, perhaps we could kind of go back to your own actually engagement with Kusama. You have worked with and shown Kusama's work several times in your career, including a major exhibition, Kusama Tricks, from 2004, which was the second exhibition at the Mori Art Museum since its opening in 2003. It was an exhibition that was mostly consisted of the old immersive installations and environments that Kusama is known for, one of the things that Kusama is known for. So the question that I want to ask to start off is, how has your own understanding and appreciation of Kusama and her practice have evolved and developed over the years?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, I can't remember when I first saw her work in the past, but I saw her retrospective at the MoMA in '98. Then the Mori Art Museum Kusama show was 2004, which I didn't curate, but I was the part of the team. And then, but also several times I showed and saw her different works. But at the beginning, Because of her practices from 60s, then I thought she was more sort of like historical artist. But then bringing her most recent works in 2004 Xamatrix show, then she was really like a contemporary artist of our time. And then bringing mostly her installation work, immersive work, and also she made a lot of new works. And then there are many Kusama retrospective happened since then. In 2012, Tate Modern started the touring of her show, but also coincided with the moment that Louis Vuitton used her images, their merchandise. Now they're doing second time around. And but really how I started to look at dots and nets, same motive of negative and positive. And as her hallucination, that she is, even in the space, she could see all the polka dots and net all over the space. Then I started to share that vision. Then I thought I started to understand better this cosmic view.
I mean, that also, I mean, I think we can kind of come back to the sort of last point that you made in your lecture about the Buddhist understanding of the universe that leads to emancipation. But before we get there, which is very relevant to Kusama, by the way, and perhaps we can dive a little bit more into your experience of putting together that last exhibition, group exhibition of 16 artists, Listen to the Sound of the Earth Turning. So first, if you can share with us what the audience responses and reactions were like to that exhibition.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I should say that I was co-curated by myself and then also my assistant curator Haruko there, and then also Toku, another curator. When we were discussing internally among our curators, what should we be doing as a Mori Art Museum at the moment? And then everyone had a chance to propose different ideas. And then three of us had quite sort of similar or some partly overlapping idea of showing that element of legitimacy of the art. And then it was quite quiet show, I have to say. It's not sort of a lot of, like the very contemplating show that you have to spend quiet time with the work. But actually people did spend long time with the show. And then I was surprised to see one of the Japanese art magazine, BT magazine's survey of the year, people listed as the third most sort of memorable show after Liu Fan and Lichter Soul Exhibition. So I was like, wow, I was so happy that people thought that show was memorable because, yeah, I always wanted to make a show that goes to your mind or heart instead of your intellectual understanding. So that's kind of way that probably the show spoke to the people, yeah, particularly when people really started to talk about well-being because, yeah, we don't have a Japanese translation for well-being. So we use the sound, phonetic sound as it is. And then people started to use the word after pandemic, and people really started to think, what is the well-being? Because it's not about the physical health, but also mentally and socially, you have to be healthy, and that's kind of state of a well-being. So yeah, that was something that people could come up with their own feeling and try to resonate with the works that they see in the show.
So as you were walking us through, starting from Kusama, then to Louise Bourgeois and Chiharu Shiota, and then other artists who are included in this group exhibition, such as Montien Bunma and Xiaowei Tsai and whatnot, I kind of sense that your presentation suggests a kind of a different now post-pandemic understanding of very definitions of art and artists. So I was just, as I was listening to it, was trying to think of what are the existing, very well established, sometimes even classical definitions of what art is and what art does and what an artist is and does. So I started just writing down a few things. Of course, very classical, almost a Renaissance understanding, art is a window to the world. Art, we often think of it as an alternative universe, alternative reality, or alternative possibility. Art can be a portal to different dimensions. Art can be an escape hatch, perhaps. Then also, we all have understanding or image of an artist as many things. Sometimes artist is a genius, an artist is a rebel, artist is a social conscience, artist can be an analyst of difficult realities that we live in. I thought about this, the quote, which is actually the title of the work from 1967 by American artist Bruce Nauman, which is simply says, "The true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths." I thought maybe collectively, even though the practices are quite different between the ones that you have addressed, I felt that you were trying to suggest a changed understanding of what art can do and what an artist does in this exhibition and in this lecture. So could you say a bit more about what has happened in your own understanding, in your mind?
Yeah, actually, I'm really bad at faking myself. So I have to really work with the artists I really like, or I really have to work with the work that speaks to me. So it has to come to me, and yeah, also it's the balance of your logical, intellectual understanding, but also it comes to my mind very strongly. And yeah, as some of you might have gone through Venice Biennale and the Documenta or this recent work, that recent Lars exhibition, and then you see, because the art is always a reflection of what is happening in real world too. Then when the world or society is so chaotic, then you see all these difficult, chaotic, complicated works also. And then you start seeing so much trouble happening in many parts of the world through artist works. So one of the role that art can play is really talks about the social state and from the different perspective. So to rebuild this or understand the diversity of the world is one of the very important role of the arts that can play now. But at the same time, I started to think, if the world is so different and everyone is so different, how can we still be connected? How can we understand what other people are thinking from total different time and also totally different part of the world? Then I started, often come back to this very sort of probably classic way of thinking about emotion. And yeah, sometimes maybe in the time of conceptual art and minimal art, maybe, or the people kind of deleted your emotional state from your work, and then you wanted to sort of approach more logically. But then, yeah, something about this people's emotion is always goes beyond national boundaries, and you can feel your loss of your family member or encountering with the death and all these life-changing experiences, very similar to everyone, that how impactful for yourself. So yeah, I was questioning, and after the traveling Chiharu Shiota show in a different parts in Asia, and it's fascinating that everyone instantly understand and then they react without really understanding where she's from and her background. And yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you the reverse question about this, the reaction of the audience to the Kusama show, because Kusama is, of course, now superstar and she can do record-breaking show. But why is it? I, I don't think it's because she's so pop and Instagrammable and colorful, but it's something more than that.
I, yes, absolutely. I mean, audience responses have been overwhelmingly positive. But really, wouldn't have been able to understand the source of that fascination with Kusama amongst so many people, really global fascination. I wouldn't have been able to really understood that if we hadn't gone through the extra layers of difficulty because, of course, of the pandemic. So this exhibition took 4 years to organize. We initiated the project in 2018, and originally it was going to open in 2021, but it was delayed by 1 year. So, and we were organizing it while in isolation in Hong Kong, because of course Hong Kong was very much a closed city. So myself and my colleagues at the museum were essentially trapped in Hong Kong, as all of us experienced. And then my co-curator is based in the United States, so many Zoom calls. So it is quite a miracle that we were able to pull together more than 200 works from more than 30 different lenders, while also realizing 2 site-specific installations. But in terms of a curatorial process, I think because, of course, the heightened awareness of the pandemic and health, physical and mental, and the idea of well-being, all of that was very much in the front of all of our mind. I think it was through that lens that we really analyzed and reflected upon Kusama's practice and ideas. Certain things are, of course, very well known. There are her infinity net paintings that you talked about, accumulation sculptures that you also talked about. But in this exhibition, there are certain new curatorially driven ideas that we introduce, such as radical connectivity or biocosmic. So what we are arguing in this exhibition, not arguing actually, I should just say offering and suggesting to the audience, is that by looking at Kusama's practice and her philosophy through this lens, examining it from different facets, you get deeper into the philosophical foundation of her practice. And I really believe that foundation, that philosophy resonates with people. So you may not consciously understand by just looking at the work, but I think you can emotionally resonate and vibrate with what Kusama is trying to say. And I think that's really the source of that fascination. And I always explain to people that if you may know Kusama originally because of, she paints cute pumpkins and polka dots, but if that's all she does, then your attention will be very short. But I think the fascination has something so much more profound that you may not, again, immediately understand it, but you can sense it. And I think that's the source of resonance. And then this process of organizing the exhibition with an extended period of time also helped me understood that certain ideas and terms that she uses that may at first sound provocative or even ominous, like terms such as a self-obliteration. I mean, this is, like, what is that? I mean, this is a very scary sounding word, but she talks about that as her own way of understanding the transcendence, actually, that you empty your egos and your souls, and you dissolve the boundaries of selves, so that we can be all infinitely connected to one another, but with nature and also with the universe. And I think that goes back to the word that you used, the emancipation. And in Buddhist thinking, it is by thinking of microcosmos and macrocosmos as not binary, but as one and the same. So, yeah, I mean, I as a curator, it was such a privilege to be able to have that deep thinking around an artist's career, and then it's a very long-winded answer, but I think then I got convinced that this is why people are so fascinated with Kusama.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that people might think that curator knows about the artist all well before they start curating the show. But actually, so much happens during the process of preparation of the show, and actually seeing the work and talking with the artist. So yeah, it's really important to dive yourself deep into this whole practice of the artist. But I think this energy that created by Kusama herself is just amazing. Yeah. And this latest series of painting, how many did she paint?
So
8,000? 8?
Not quite 8,000. I mean, she's extremely productive. She still paints every day. The series, My Eternal Soul, some of the paintings that you started the lecture with all come from My Eternal Soul series, which she began in 2009 and continued until 2021. I think she painted a bit over 900, just shy of 1,000. So, she's now 94 years old, but in her 80s and 90s, she is unstoppable.
Yeah, but I think this energy for life, for continued living, is really obviously coming from by creating new work. And even thinking about Louise Bourgeois living until 99 is just simply amazing. That very sort of the powerful works that came after 80s and 90s, but their recognition came later. And those artists continue what they believed in, regardless of this acknowledgement by the art community and the different timing. So I think they continue what they do, and sometimes art world look at what they do, and then different wave comes. So I think Kusama had maybe 3-4 different waves in her practice. So that long career.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of how things come in stages or in ebbs and flows, maybe that's a good segue to one of the questions from the audience here. Has it become easier to curate exhibitions that speak to fears and anxieties since the dawn of social media, which makes it permissible to be vulnerable?
I don't really understand the question.
So, because I think maybe another way to say it is that the social media turned all of us into I guess if you put it positively, open and transparent. If you put it a bit not so positively, narcissistic, that we all share and overshare. So now that has become a collective social behavior. Has that made it easier to curate exhibitions that speak to fears and anxieties?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it made it easier to curate exhibitions, but people's understanding of the world could have become superficial or just sort of reactionary to the surface or what you see in a short text or images. And what I really wanted to deliver through making exhibition at the museum is I really want people to come and experience physically in that space. And so that is, and as more the people put up these images on social media, more people comes. It's quite interesting because there's sometimes at the opening, the people come and take 30 pictures and upload everything. So I'm like, don't show everything. We just opened. I want people to come and see. But then still people come to actually see the show. And so I'm always interested in these differences because a lot of good works for me is very different when you actually see the work. And there are also the works that you think it looks great on the social media, but once you come, this is it. So sometimes it's like looks better on social media than real experience. So I'm really looking for the works that have a strong presence or power by seeing in reality.
So here's another question. Can you tell us more about how time and labor behind art making might be related to healing and well-being? I found this quite a common feature. So I think this question refers to the works and the artists that you have shown that have that are time-consuming and labor-intensive.
Yeah, I always feel this certain energy, invisible energy around the work. And then if artists put very strong emotion and energy and probably the time and labor has something to do with the energy of the work itself. And I often feel it. So yeah, to me it's very important to really imagine what was the process of making the work, not only actual sort of labor of painting or covering the surface of the canvas, but more about the thought process, the thinking process, and then also the reflection of the actual life experience of the artist. So what happened to this person and how and when and how all these works are made. So this imagination of the process adds up to the appreciation of what actually see as the surface of the painting. So yeah, it's subjective, but when I try to really understand the core emotion of the person who made the particular work, yeah, you actually feel that energy.
If I can, there are many questions here. This is probably a question that's on a lot of people's mind, even if it is not necessarily directly related. How do you view the collaboration of artist Kusama with the Louis Vuitton brand?
I thought when she did in 2012, that was quite interesting how much she was again received by a very large number of people across the world. And yeah, I only think that was an entry point for people to understand her core mindset for making art. And because in 2012 that was coinciding with this major retrospective by Tate and travel to, I think, Pompidou and Whitney. So that was just very good timing for the artist to be understood. And I haven't really met the artist herself for many times, but whenever I remember the memory of her talking about her work, she really loves that many people likes her work, and whenever we bring the magazine of herself on a cover or like newspaper article, she was like, I'm so thankful to people who come and see my show. So for her, it's really great thing that everybody, like so many people likes her work.
I think there was a question about the exhibition here specifically on So I'm just looking for the
There's a question about M+ show.
Oh, there you go. In Kusama exhibition at M+, there is a green room, green walled section about death before the bright yellow room that is called Force of Life. How do you feel Kusama confronts her own mortality?
Why did you make this green wall section and yellow room?
Well, okay, so it is exhibition design. Most of the galleries are classic white cube, but working very closely with our in-house design team, that we wanted to have just some accents of color in certain sections. So when you first enter, the walls are purple, and that's the section. It's a kind of preface or introduction to the exhibition that shows 12 self-portraits ranging in date from 1950 to 2020. So, that's about really bringing out the range of colors that are used in such a diverse range of canvases, but also it's a bit of a drama as well. Then you go through most of the rooms that are quite classical. We try not to interfere too much with the works themselves, but we felt that this section, physically the smallest, but actually the most emotionally intense section, called Death. I mean, it's starkly titled simply Death. We felt that we needed to kind of turn down the temperature and the lux level, because each work in that room, whether it's a big installation of a soft sculpture or even actually the earliest work in that exhibition, is in that section, which is a drawing of the dead husk of corn that she drew at the age of 16. So that section really talks about her obsession with death. But we intentionally positioned that next to the final section of the exhibition, which is called Force of Life. And this is where you see the selections from that create just a burst of energy in her art making in the last 20 years or so. So how do I feel Kusama confront her own mortality? I think she has been confronting her mortality all her life. In the death section, there is a very striking painting called, it shows this surrealistic vortex that shows a little circle in the middle. And then when you look at it very closely, the circle shows a kind of a wilderness with the two barren trees. And when you look at the title, then you get startled because it says accumulation of corpses. And it has a subtitle that says prisoner encircled by curtains of depersonalization, a painting from 1950. And I always explain to the viewers, to the visitors, that you have to understand how radical this was. In 1950, just a few years after the end of the war, so of course everyone remembers devastation that was brought onto Japan. But as a young woman of 21 years old, to talk about, in fact, her own mental health struggle, and to put it in the title is a courageous thing. It was an extremely risky thing to do. But here, it's a perfect example of, at the very beginning of her professional career, she's talking about mortality, not just in terms of herself, but in terms of the group of people and then even the whole humanity. So in many ways, I think she has been propelling herself all throughout her life by being, in a sense, obsessed with mortality.
I always feel that she's already in an infinite state. So there's no boundary between life and death, probably, like something that Chiharu also said, that you only kind of dissolved in the cosmic space. And yeah, she often says the ai wa tokosheni, like love is infinite, and eternity she often talks about. And from like my feeling of her confronts her own mortality is already she's somewhere in between and always has been, and she will never kind of totally disappear.
So I guess one thing then, I mean, we talked about sort of more evolved or changed understanding of what artists do and what art can do. So if we can really see what art through that lens, that it sort of shifts our understanding of what moral means, what mortality means, then perhaps that is exactly the power of healing and power of well-being that art can bring to all of us.
Yeah, for some people, there was a question about the Chiharu's practice, that why she is kind of needed this fear or anxiety, and maybe it's not applied to everyone in the whole world, but at least for artists like Chiharu or Kusama or the artists, that it's so crucial that he has very deep emotional engagement with expressing yourself, or probably like externalizing your deep emotion and giving a form or a shape or some sort and share with others. So that's the way of, really sort of objectifying what they were doing and also finding a way of where they were going, why they are living. So it's very powerful way of dealing with yourself, probably.
There is it's an act of radical generosity as well, to bear yourself, to share with others. So I think our time is up now, so perhaps that's the point where we can end. And thank you again, Mami, for really sharing your practice.
Thank you very much.
And also practices of the artist. Thank you so much to the audience as well.